Good morning. This weekend, the Prime Minister Boris Johnson is unpopular. I've been covering politics for 40 years, and it's hard to remember the press being this hostile to a Premier. Not in the last days of Margaret Thatcher, not over Maastricht, or when things were going wrong in Iraq, or during the last days of Theresa May. And there's an interesting by-election next week, so let's remind ourselves that Johnson was recently the Tory party's not-so-secret weapon, the showman politician who got a hearing in parts of the country other Conservatives couldn't, the apparently chaotic joker who, to his rivals' fury, seemed again and again to defy gravity. Today's question: can he come back? Meanwhile, as COVID cases continue to rise sharply, millions of families are nervously remembering what happened with schools in January. Will history repeat itself? I'll be speaking to the Education Secretary, Nadim Zahawi, and to the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, who could choose this morning to unite his forces with unhappy Tory MPs and vote down the government's new COVID restrictions in England. Away from the politics, and for a clear-eyed assessment of what Omicron means for Christmas and beyond, I'll be joined by the UK Health Agency's Dr. Susan Hopkins. Also this morning, Jeremy Irons has been telling me about playing Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain in an adaptation of Robert Harris's thriller Munich.
Oh, for God's sake, you can't go and see Hitler entirely on your own.
Can and will. Gentlemen, we must rise to the level of events.
Reviewing the news, a 2019 MP who won Bishop Auckland for the Conservatives for the first time ever, Dehenna Davison, and Alison Phillips, editor of the Daily Mirror, whose picture of the Prime Minister taking part in a Christmas quiz is dominating the news this morning. So much to fit in over the next hour. We will begin with the headlines from Ben Thompson.
Andrew, thank you. Good morning. The Prime Minister is facing further questions today about Christmas gatherings at Downing Street a year ago, after a photo emerged of him taking part in a quiz. The picture obtained by the Sunday Mirror shows Boris Johnson sitting next to two colleagues at a time when social mixing between households was banned in London. Downing Street says he briefly attended the event, which was held virtually. People in England aged between 30 and 39 can book their booster jab from tomorrow. The acceleration of the vaccination programme comes as scientists warn the UK could face record levels of infection from the Omicron variant without further restrictions. The US President Joe Biden has described the tornadoes that ripped through 6 states on Friday night as among the most devastating in the country's history. More than 100 people are feared to have died in the storms, and thousands more are without power and water. The state of Kentucky has been worst affected. And one of the greatest Formula One seasons comes to a climax today. It is winner takes all in Abu Dhabi, with Lewis Hamilton chasing Max Verstappen, who is in pole position. Can't wait. That's all the news from me for now. The next on BBC One is at 1 o'clock. Andrew, back to you.
But away from the racing, and thanks for that, the front pages, as we mentioned earlier on, the Sunday Mirror has a picture of Boris Johnson giving what they say tinsel, Santa hats and bubbly as Boris hosts this COVID-breaking number 10 Christmas quiz. Yes, he was taking us for fools again. How serious is that? We'll be talking about that in a moment. The Sunday Telegraph, however, suggests that he is facing a cabinet-level revolt, as well as many junior ministers and, of course, backbenchers over the COVID rules that he is imposing through the House of Commons in the week ahead. The Sunday Times, NHS staff are ready to jab children as young as 5, says their lead story. They've also got a very interesting right-through about the build-up of Russian forces on the border of the Ukraine. That may be the really big story none of us are talking enough about at the moment. And finally, the Mail on Sunday, Boris blast at BBC over Partygate, saying the BBC is making too much of his parties. I would candidly and gently suggest to the Prime Minister he might take a look at some of the Conservative papers this morning, including the Sunday Telegraph. On its op-ed pages, he thinks the BBC are tough. Now, Alison, your front page is, as we said, making some splash this morning. Just talk us through what happened and why you imply that he was breaking the rules in London at the time.
Yes. So the picture that's on the front page of the Sunday Mirror today shows it was taken inside Downing Street on December the 15th, last Christmas. Now, if you cast your mind back to that point, London was in Tier 2, and the rule was explicitly you must not have a work Christmas lunch or party where that is a primarily social activity. So this quiz takes place after work from 6:30 p.m. onwards. And the source that we have that was inside there says nobody was working. It was purely a social event. So clearly, as you can see from that, that was in breach of the COVID rules. So during the event, there were different people in different rooms at Downing Street taking part in the quiz. And at one point, Boris Johnson appears on a screen reading out some of the questions, and he's there flanked by two others. So again, he is in a group of more than two, which was the rule at that point, for a social event. So it's really that straightforward.
So yeah, I was just going to say, I assume what number 10 would say if they were sitting here instead of me was they'd say, well, it was over a screen. He wasn't in the same room as the other people. It's nothing like a party. You're making too much of this, Daily Mirror.
Well, there's 2 points there. The first is that he was in a room with other people with more than 2 people for a social event. And the second point is that throughout the building, there was up to 24 people in one room, and there were lots of other rooms of around 6 people and more than that. And they were being encouraged to take part in a quiz where at that time, indoors, you were not allowed to have more than 2 people if it wasn't for work. And this wasn't work. So we're not saying, they were doing the conga down the middle of the office. This was a Christmas quiz, but it was a Christmas quiz outside of the rules.
Dehenna, Davison, we've had all sorts of reports of hoolies of different kinds and parties and wild goings on. Does this matter, do you think, this particular story?
I mean, I think, looking at some of the reports we've seen over this week and alleged parties, I think hosting a kind of online quiz that predominantly was online probably is pretty minor. I know my team and I did an online quiz. We were all at home doing it over a Zoom screen. But I think, if people were in the office, working from the office, I assume for a reason, because obviously we were all asked to work from home at the time, and sort of stuck around afterwards to take part because they couldn't make it home in time to take part in the quiz from home. I'm kind of more relaxed about it, even though it might not be entirely
Well, I was going to say an awful lot of people will be at home, lonely at Christmas at the same time, and they've read all these stories of reports and goings-on in Downing Street. What are they saying in Bishop Auckland about this?
I think there's a sense of frustration because last Christmas for so many people was so difficult. I mean, I remember my own mum crying when I called her to say, having planned to spend Christmas together, we had to change those plans given the sort of change in restrictions. And that's a very minor case compared to what some people had to go through, not seeing relatives when they were ill and, perhaps missing a last Christmas with them. So people are frustrated that, they had that really difficult Christmas, and then to see kind of signs that perhaps other people at the heart of power weren't following the restrictions as stringently as people at home were. It's been really difficult for sure.
And now we have the suggestion that because of these parties and because what people see as hypocrisy and indeed lying, when new restrictions come, they're simply not going to do what they're told. That's the front page of the or the meat of the front page of the Observer story. What's your view about that?
Well, it's a really interesting piece in the Observer here, and there was a sort of behavioural scientist commenting, saying that already people are fatigued with restrictions, and I think going in and out of restrictions is particularly difficult. You can kind of get used to it, you can get used to the isolation to some extent, but when you're given that glimpse of freedom to then have it clawed back, that's difficult in and of itself. But I think, I've certainly had emails come through my inbox, people saying, we're fed up, we're done, we've read the papers this week, we're not following the rules, we're spending Christmas with our families. So I think it could be damaging. And obviously, we all still need to play our part to curb this virus and make sure it's not spreading.
So you're nodding there, Alison, Phillips. Do you think Mirror readers are going to look at these stories and think, do you know what, I've had enough, I'm not going to go through this again?
I really hope that's not the case, but what we're hearing from our readers is that they are really sick and tired, as Dehenna said. And there's an interesting piece that we've got in the Mirror today as well from Peter Fahey, who was the former Chief Constable of Greater Manchester. And he says it's going to be incredibly difficult for police to enforce if there are more restrictions, which looks quite possible at the moment, because the trust has broken down. And if you don't have trust in a relationship between those who govern and those who are supposed to abide by the rules, it's impossible. And at the heart of all this, we have to remember we're still in the middle of a huge public health crisis. People are going to die over the coming weeks and months, and it is imperative that we abide by the rules. But the biggest problem we have perhaps here, and I think that's what the quiz story demonstrates, is that it's part of a culture of rule breaking, and that even up until last week, we had the Prime Minister saying he had no knowledge of any social gatherings or that there weren't any. And so it's this lack of trust, which is going to make the next month very difficult.
Right. Dehenna, that is the big issue for the government, lack of trust. On Tuesday, I think they're bringing in new restrictions, including vaccine passports. What are you, as a backbench Conservative, going to do about that?
Well, I've already been quite public and said I won't be voting for vaccine passports. I've expressed my concerns about them for months, you know, both to government, to the whips, but also kind of more publicly. And I think my inbox, you know, talking about the party story, my inbox has been flooded, not with people talking about the kind of potential Downing Street parties, but actually about people really concerned about vaccine passports in particular, concerned about an extra restriction on freedom, particularly in light of the kind of evidence that we've seen about Omicron, with 0 people in the UK, thankfully 0 people in the UK dying from the Omicron variant. It does perhaps seem a little bit premature to introduce something that could be really damaging for the hospitality sector that has already had such a difficult 2 years.
And it's not just you, obviously. Many of your colleagues on the backbenches take the same view. And we read this morning, possibly even some cabinet ministers agree with you, and some junior ministers, some of whom may resign, some very junior ministers. So this is a big moment for the government. Do you hope that Boris Johnson is actually defeated this week?
Well, I mean, I'm not backing vaccine passports, so on that particular thing, then, you know, I certainly hope that they're not introduced. But rather than a defeat, I'd rather see the government kind of
change
not
direction.
push the legislation. Yeah, absolutely.
So you think he might still pull this?
I have no idea. You know, I haven't been privy to those sort of high-level conversations, but certainly that's what I'd hope would happen, to look at a better plan that, you know, all of us can get behind, because there is a lot of concern amongst backbenchers in particular, but as you said, amongst some in government, that perhaps we aren't quite going down the right track. And we all want to get behind this. We all want to make sure that
but this is
the
a
country
huge
pulls
rebellion,
through.
isn't it? I mean, this is potentially a very, very important big rebellion. Would you like to see the Labour Party beside you in those voting lobbies or not?
What the Labour Party do, I'm sure you can ask Keir Starmer when he's on in a little while.
Let me just ask him now, actually. Keir Starmer, you were listening to that. It's perfectly clear, or it looks pretty clear from the numbers, that you could defeat these measures in the House of Commons. You've already said as a party that they won't work. And by doing that, you could bring about a vote of confidence in the Prime Minister next week. Will you?
Well, Andrew, throughout the pandemic, we've acted in the public interest. I'm very concerned about the new variant, and I do think these measures are necessary. Therefore, we'll be voting for the measures on Tuesday to protect the NHS and protect the public. We're not going to be tempted into playing party politics here. We will act in the public interest.
All right, well, that gives us a pretty clear answer. The Prime Minister is not going to be defeated in the House of Commons next week. Can I ask Alison Phillips again? Lots of different Omicron-related stories in the papers today, but the Sunday Times is a very interesting one, suggesting that children are now going to be jabbed. Do you think this is crossing a line that's going to worry people?
Well, the story in the Sunday Times is that children as young as 5 could then start being jabbed. So we've seen 12 and above, and this could really happen quite soon. There's been a concern about the jabbing of children, and the take-up in the older teenage age group hasn't. I think it's around about 40% at the moment, and we're kind of a long way behind what's happening elsewhere in Europe and in the States around the jabbing of children. I think this probably speaks to sort of a wider problem about there's still work to be done, convincing parents about the safety and the importance of jabbing children and for the wider societal good, and that we know that most of the infections that have come about in the last 6 months or so have come from children. And so every child that is infected will go home to a family with adults and grandparents, and that's where the danger is. So this is a really serious point that needs to be kind of talked through, and all the work has to be done around reassurance. We have to be looking at all the falseness that's still going around on social media to get an effective message out.
Sure. Dehenna, there's been a lot of swirl around the House of Commons. There always is when these crises come about. Letters being sent to the chairman of the 1922 committee for a leadership challenge to Boris Johnson. We'll see if that happens. But given that he had been such an important Conservative force in the north of England, and given the miserable, awful time he's having at the moment, what does he now need to do to come back?
Well, it's certainly not been an easy few years since he sort of became Prime Minister, facing so many kind of crises. I think trust is so important, that trust point that Alison mentioned and you mentioned earlier.
So how can he get it back?
Well, I think firstly, we need to make sure we're doing the right thing over COVID to pull through the winter, make sure the NHS is protected, but also make sure that people still feel that sense of freedom, people get the Christmas that they kind of feel they deserve. But beyond that, it's about keeping the rest of the promises that were made during the general election, which is, you know, the big picture stuff like, you know, more GPs, more police officers and those sort of big figures, but also helping us as MPs to really deliver on our local pledges too. And I think the government has a pretty good record on this. We have things like the Levelling Up Fund, the Stronger Towns Fund, which are really bringing changes to some of these left behind areas. But it's proving to those people that the government remains on their side. So yeah, continuing to deliver and pushing more to help some of these left behind areas. You know, Bishop Auckland has been underinvested in for a really long time. We need to see real change.
You need to see change. You need to see some money spent.
It's not just money, more than money, but a bit of money would be nice too.
All right, Dehenna, Davison, Alison, Phillips, thanks both very much indeed for that in a busy morning. Now, the weather, it's been very, very cold at times this winter, this week. I have been drenched in torrential rain. It's getting a little bit Christmassy now, but what about the week ahead? Owain Wynne-Evans is in the Weather Centre. Owen.
Andrew, thank you very much indeed. Well, yes, we're kind of moving away from that actually over the next couple of days in terms of our temperatures anyway. We're importing milder air, and I think we'll all notice that pretty much wherever we are. There's the headline for today then, a mild one. It'll be pretty cloudy and we do have some rain around as well. Now, the big picture shows this. There's an area of low pressure moving towards us from the west. Now, this weather front here will bring some rain, but the low pressure itself will bring some rather unsettled conditions. But we are in mild air. It's moving towards us. There's the weather front moving into parts of Northern Ireland, leaving here later on quite breezy, then moving through parts of the north of England and into Scotland. The very far north of Scotland remaining chilly. We'll see some clear spells here. The outbreaks of rain continuing for a time. Whereas I think, you know, much of England and Wales and Northern Ireland will see bright sunny spells developing, but still pretty cloudy with some mist and fog lingering as well. Let's return to that area of low pressure. That'll bring very unsettled conditions at times as we head through tonight across parts of Scotland, turning windy across Northern Ireland as well. But the strength of the wind really affecting western parts of Scotland, the Western Isles, the Hebrides, moving up towards the Northern Isles then, gusts of potentially 80 to 85 miles per hour. Lows tonight are between 9 and 11 Celsius. Tomorrow we'll see some rain, but the milder air reaches most of us then over the next couple of days. So for now, we're turning up those temperatures just a bit. Andrew, back to you.
Very many thanks for that. Now, as you might have spotted, Sir Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, is here with me.
Good morning.
Good morning, Sir Keir. Now, you used to be head of the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service. Do you think the Prime Minister broke the rules in that Christmas quiz?
Well, I do think that new allegation is very serious. And the reason it's serious is because, of course, at the time, the government was asking the public not to see loved ones, and many people didn't see loved ones last Christmas
and London
at
was
all.
In tier 2,
many of them didn't see their loved ones again, and that's why this has created such fury. And, you know, this is only the latest of the allegations. And I remember that it was only Wednesday that the Prime Minister stood up in Parliament and said he was furious that he had just found out that there may have been breaches of the rules in Downing Street. He was talking about the party on the 18th of December. Now we learned this morning that 3 days earlier he was involved, he was leading a quiz in Downing Street, which, if the reports are accurate, involved groups of people. I think it was being set up to 24 people in one room, using their computer screens, but actually involving themselves in a social event. And so he'd be doubly furious now he finds that he himself has been involved in something which may have breached the rules.
I come back to my CPS question, as it were. I think London was in tier 2 at the time, which said that nobody could be meeting for a non-work purpose more than, I think, 2 people in a room together. So,
yes.
Given that, was he breaking the law?
Well, it looks as though he was. And he must have known those other groups were in other rooms in his own building. And, you know, this is very important because he's damaged his authority. He's now so weak, his party is so divided, he can't deliver the leadership that this country needs. And we've got a very important vote coming up next week. And he can't even discharge the basic functions of government. He's the worst possible leader at the worst possible time.
And you've just said that he broke the law in Downing Street.
Well, it appears, we'll have to look into it, but it's very hard to see how that's compliant with the rules.
given that, up to now, you have not called for him to resign. Surely, given that, you must now think that he should resign.
Well, we need to look at the allegation. It's only one of the allegations and establish the facts. But it is very, very serious for the Prime Minister.
I'll come back to that. Should he resign or not?
Look, if me calling for him to resign would lead to his resignation, that'd be one thing. But I live in the real world where I know that the most significant issue here is the breach of trust, because we're about to have further measures that are necessary because of the variant. And at that very moment, the trust in the Prime Minister is at an all-time low.
Well, let's return to the real world and those measures. As I was discussing earlier on, they're coming to the House of Commons. There is a big Conservative rebellion brewing on that.
Yes.
Now, you could join in that because you have said yourself as a party that these measures are not going to work against Omicron. So given that the measures aren't going to work, why are you not trying to, as it were, force a vote of confidence in the Prime Minister?
Let me address that. I spoke to the government medical advisors on Monday, on Wednesday. I spoke to my own advisors yesterday, and I think the measures that are going to be introduced on Tuesday are necessary because of the great threat now that the new variant poses. And in those circumstances, the Labour Party will show leadership. We will do what is in the public interest to protect the NHS and to protect the public. Now, of course, I've had lots of people saying to me, well, of course, you could take political advantage of the Prime Minister's weakness and bring him down.
I'm sorry to jump in,
but we have always acted in the public interest throughout this pandemic. We will do that on Tuesday. We will show the leadership that the Prime Minister is not able to show. And one last thing on this, Andrew, if I may, because he has so damaged his authority that without Labour votes on Tuesday, he is not even able to discharge the basic function of government, keeping the public safe. Because
so you've got leverage. How are you going to use that leverage?
Well, in the first instance, we will vote in the public interest on Tuesday. But we have been saying for months that the booster programme needs to be boosted itself. We said that 2 months ago. It needed to go up to 500,000 a day. The government's behind the curve again. There are other measures we've been calling for a very long time. Sort out statutory sick pay. One of the big problems is people can't afford to self-isolate. And a lot of the infection is running through our schools.
Are you going to make the government change direction on that, for instance?
Well, I hope so, Andrew.
Well, you say you hope so, because up to now, at every point, you have voted with the government in this long saga. You vote again and again.
We have voted in the public interest.
With the government.
Yes, because,
with the government.
Well, no, the position I've taken is this. We listen to the government scientists and our own advisors, and we follow the science. And where it is absolutely clear that measures are necessary in the public interest, we have and we will vote for them. And so it's the opposite of party politics.
Yeah.
It's actually
you yourself have said that Boris Johnson is, and I quote, a threat to public health.
Yes.
Why don't you take him on then?
Well, he is a threat to public health because, we can argue all morning about what the rules should be, whether this measure is necessary or that measure is necessary. The critical question is, will the public follow the rules? And they have been following the rules, but now that trust is broken and many people are now saying, well, if the Prime Minister is going to allow breaking of the rules, parties, quizzes going on in Downing Street, when we're being asked not to see our loved ones, well, why should I follow the rules? And so, of course, there's the question of what the conditions should be, but there's also this basic question of trust. And that is broken with the Prime Minister.
Okay.
And that's why he is unfit for office. That's why
he's unfit for office. He's a threat to public health,
yes.
But you're keeping him in office.
Well,
just explain that.
Andrew, if I could snap my fingers, call on him to resign and he would resign, then of course that'd be the easiest thing for the leader of the opposition to do. The question I have to answer is, well, what would we do differently? What would a Labour government do differently? And if you had a Labour government, you'd have a government that was based on honesty and integrity. You'd have a government that was ahead of the curve, not behind the curve. And actually, you'd have a government that had a culture of complying with standards in public office. There are 7 standards in public office, the Nolan principles. We would abide by all of them. Boris Johnson can't abide by any of them.
Given the arithmetic in the House of Commons right now, as I said, you have real leverage. You can persuade the government to do things they might not otherwise do. Can I ask you, in these circumstances, what you are asking for from the government as the price of your support?
Well, it won't be the price of our support, Andrew, because I'm not supporting the government on Tuesday. I'm supporting the NHS and the public. And if you look at the science in relation to Omicron, the new variant, there is a real concern that we could be in a situation where the number of cases is doubling in as short a period as 2 days. Now, I understand people say, well, that hasn't led to higher hospitalisations and deaths yet, but the sheer volume of cases is very, very worrying, and that's uppermost in my mind. So I'm not supporting the Prime Minister on Tuesday. I'm supporting our NHS, and I'm supporting the public in relation to this pandemic. What I do want...
And you're supporting, in this vote, you're supporting vaccine passports, which is something you yourself said was un-British.
Yeah, I've been, I am concerned about the idea of vaccine passports. I'm not comfortable with it, but I'm persuaded that it is necessary, particularly if it's linked to the alternative of a negative test, which is what a lot of venues have been operating on a voluntary basis now for a very long time. I went to Arsenal Football Club yesterday to watch the match, as I always do. That system's been in place on a voluntary basis, so we know that it works. But am I comfortable with these restrictions and measures? No, I wish we didn't have to have them. But I'm persuaded that we do.
OK, what about mandatory vaccination, something that other countries have brought in, has been talked about here? Would the Labour Party support that?
No, we don't believe in mandatory vaccinations. There may be a case in relation to the NHS in April as proposed, but that's contingent on the government. The government would have to deal with
if they brought in mandatory vaccinations, you would stop that happening.
I don't think you can have mandatory vaccinations for the whole of the country because there are so many people who, for whatever reason, can't have a vaccination. I actually think there's emerging evidence as to how well the double vaccination is coping with the new variant. So that's my concern, and that's why I personally think that the negative test is as important, if not more important now.
What about more restrictions on the unvaccinated?
Well, I think at the moment we need to persuade as many people to get vaccinated as possible. So many people are saying to me, I want to get my booster, but I can't get an appointment. I've been turned away, which is why the single most important thing here is not an argument at the moment about those that aren't vaccinated. It's how quickly can we get the vast majority of people through the booster, because everybody I've spoken to, all the scientists seem to be saying to me, look, the double vaccination on its own is not enough to hold this variant. The booster looks as though it is, which is why 2 months ago we asked for this to be ramped up. And the government says, well, this is a new variant. True, it is a new variant, but the new variant was always the known unknown. And yet again, we've got a government that has failed to plan. It's not serious in its response to these very serious issues.
And yet again, some people will say we've got the Labour Party voting with them. We've discussed that. But can I ask you, given this... Sorry.
Are you seriously putting to me that on Tuesday, for political party advantage, I should vote against public health measures which will protect our NHS?
I'm just asking...
That is not... a Labour government under me will always...
Your party has said these measures won't work, and yet you're going to vote them through.
I'm saying they're necessary. They're necessary. And I hope that they create enough space, enough time, if you like, for the booster to be administered to as many people as possible. That will only happen if there's a serious plan to ramp it up, which is what we've been calling on the government to put in place.
This started with parties in number 10. Can you give me, and everybody watching, an absolute pledge that there were no Labour Party Christmas parties last year?
I can, and I'm sure that evidence would have emerged if there had been. We were following the rules.
And you've checked that, have you?
As the vast majority of the public were following the rules because it was very important to do so. And, the Prime Minister pretends that he's only just found out that there was a party in his own building last year. I don't believe that for a minute, and I don't think the public do.
All right, so Keir Starmer, thanks very much indeed for coming in to talk to us. Now, 2 big COVID questions remain this morning. Does Omicron make people as sick as previous variants? And is the government going to introduce further measures to curb the spread? Well, Dr. Susan Hopkins is the Chief Medical Advisor to the UK Health Security Agency.
So I think firstly to say that we're still in the early days of understanding Omicron and how it affects people. Secondly, that clearly if you've had a prior infection or you've had vaccination, we would expect you to have less severe disease. However, the sheer weight of numbers that look like are coming towards us with the Omicron infection means that it will find those people who are unvaccinated or who've had a poor response to the vaccine for their underlying immune condition. And that will still mean that we will still see individuals in hospital. In the confirmed cases in the UK at the moment, we've only had a very small number over the age of 70, who are the people we see with most severe disease in hospital. So I think it's early days for us to tell. In South Africa, that even though they are reporting that there's a lot of mild disease and a lot of people are coming into hospital with COVID rather than because of COVID, it is still using a rapidly increasing number of beds over the last 10 days.
Because they've also said, I think, that the disease, this part of the pandemic, has peaked already, and they've had no restrictions whatever. So is there a danger that in this country we are panicking a little bit too early?
So I think we're making the right restrictions right now and doing some things that will reduce transmission. We have a very different age profile in our population in the UK, a lot of an older population, average age here in the UK of close to 41 compared to 27 in South Africa. And therefore, we are at higher risk of individuals who are older, more severe underlying conditions and immunocompromised for those to get this infection with so much of it about and therefore have severe consequences. So what we're asking for is people to take their personal precautions, wearing their face coverings, use ventilation, get their vaccine if they haven't had it or get boosted if they have, to reduce the impact on hospitals and to prevent a severity of disease that will impact on all of us.
Right now, do we know that anyone has been hospitalised because of Omicron or died because of Omicron?
So we are getting reports of individuals coming into hospital over the last few days with Omicron, and we are investigating those carefully with the hospitals concerned. We're also seeing hospitals diagnose more and more people coming through their emergency departments, and we expect to see increases in that number. I have not had a reported death yet, but it's really important to remember it is just over 2 weeks since we first detected the cases in the United Kingdom, and that hospitalizations start to be seen about 2 weeks and deaths usually at 3 to 4 weeks. So I think it's too early to make any assumptions at this point in time.
Is it inevitable now that we're going to see a big wave in this country?
So it's inevitable that we're going to see a big wave of infections. What we are not yet clear on, and which is what we are basically making sure people go out and get their vaccination for, is how much that will affect hospitals. You'll have seen the results from the London School modelling, which show that, you know, at their best case scenario was that we'd have a wave similar, about half the height of January last year, which was pretty severe and caused a lot of hospitalizations and deaths, to up to twice the height. And I think that shows the uncertainty we have. And that uncertainty is related to how much the vaccine will prevent severe disease, how much prior immunity will prevent severe disease, not the size of the wave, which I think we're pretty clear is coming right at us.
Coming right at us and very big. What about the effect on hospitals? I know that overnight, last night, for instance, some London hospitals were asking anyone who wasn't really severely ill not to come in.
So hospitals are under pressure. They've been under pressure for 4 months. They are dealing with the consequences of having been under pressure for COVID for nearly 2 years now. And so we are seeing people come to hospital who are very sick, who have delayed their care because they don't want to put hospitals under pressure. What we need to be able, hospitals to be able to do is deliver care for all of those people with other conditions, as well as deliver care for COVID as necessary. So everything we can do to reduce transmission, to slow this wave down as much as we can, means that we won't have people requiring care in an acute situation in hospital and allow hospitals to do their job.
As things stand, are you worried that this new wave could overwhelm the NHS?
So I think we are worried, and we're right to be worried, because we don't have enough data to narrow those predictions and that models down to the best, finest detail yet. And it takes time to do that. I still think it will take another 2 weeks before we're clear on whether the severity that South Africa have reported in some scenarios, but not in all, is going to be reflected here. We have to prepare for the worst and hope for the best. And I think our job is to highlight that this is a big wave. It's coming straight at us. If we see even half the severity that we saw with Delta, then we're facing a very large number of hospitalizations and potential deaths.
Is the current advice to wear masks, to use vaccine passports in some circumstances, and to work from home when you can, is that enough to stop this wave?
So I think we will have to reduce our social contacts as much as we can, which is the working from home guidance. I think about my social contacts as sort of a basket. Every time I meet somebody, I'm putting myself at risk. If I've got infection, I'm putting them at risk too. So I think we have to use lateral flow devices if we're going to go out and meet people socially, or we have to go to work.
But that restricting of social contacts and so on goes beyond the restrictions being announced at the moment. Do you think that we're going to need more restrictions?
So I think that the restrictions that we have, that the government have announced, are sensible. I think that we may need to go beyond them, but we, will need to watch carefully what happens with hospitalisations.
Your colleague, Professor John Edmonds of SAGE, has said today you might be talking about something like 8,000 hospitalisations a day at the worst end with the current restrictions. If we sit and wait until we have all the evidence available to us, it may be too late to react efficiently.
So that's true, and I think that was his worst case scenario. His best case scenario, of course, was better than we faced last January. And I think the challenge is that there's a big difference between 2,000 and 10,000 admissions a day. The challenge we have and the challenge government has is trying to balance the risks and benefits to the society, to people, to the population, to the economy, and to health. And they have very difficult decisions ahead of them.
So you've given the government a list of things that might have to come in. Can I ask you what is on that list?
Well, I haven't given the government personally any list, just to be clear. The list is the same list as has been given by the SAGE committee and that are recommended through various different studies in the past. Those include things like, reducing social contacts, keeping contacts to a minimum, reducing activities in social environments. There's a lot of different options that are on the table for hospitality, for workplaces. We have not said to the government, you must do X, Y, and Z. That's not our job. Our job is to say this is the evidence and the strongest evidence, and the government have taken that point, is working from home if you can.
I suppose, Dr. Hopkins, some of us are slightly confused still that we should be working from home, but we're still allowed to have Christmas parties.
So that's people's social contact bucket, in my view. So if people decide they want to have their Christmas party, government has not said they should not have their Christmas party, but people have their own decisions to make about their Christmas parties.
So for people watching who've had 2 AstraZeneca jabs earlier in the year, how much protection do they have right now against Omicron without a booster?
So the AstraZeneca vaccine is highly likely to prevent severe disease, and that's really important. But what we're saying is that having had the vaccine more than 3 months ago, which everyone in AstraZeneca is really in that basket now, means that there's minimal protection from the vaccine to prevent mild infection in the community, and that means to prevent transmission. So particularly for those people who've had AstraZeneca, they need to come forward. But equally for Pfizer, the reductions of infections and transmissions for both vaccines were very, very similar. But once you're boosted, you get above 70% vaccine effectiveness to reduce symptomatic infection in the community.
So do you think the AZ vaccine has, as it were, done its job and we should stop using it now?
I think the AZ vaccine, we will still see excellent prevention for severe disease. And at the end of the day, these vaccines were there to prevent severe disease. Everything we can do to turn COVID into an endemic respiratory disease that does not cause hospitalizations, that does not cause deaths, that does not cause people to suffer from long-term consequences are the things that we need to prevent from this vaccine.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.
Having written about a fictional Adolf Hitler in his best-selling novel Fatherland, Robert Harris has returned to the Nazi era for his thriller Munich. The book's just been made into a film, and Jeremy Irons plays Neville Chamberlain as a hapless yet heroic Prime Minister who travels into the heart of the Third Reich to negotiate at a time of looming international crisis. Munich, the edge of war, centres on the friendship of 2 men, one British, one German, who are in both leaders' inner circles. I caught up with Jeremy Irons and Robert Harris recently.
Men and women of Britain and the Empire. As long as war is not begun, there is always hope.
Really good to see you again. Was willst du von mir? Wir sind die letzte Hoffnung, um Hitler zu stoppen.
Each of them becomes embroiled in the Munich crisis. And just as Chamberlain flies on the plane to meet Hitler in Munich, and Hitler travels on his train overnight from Berlin to Munich, these two young men travel with the two leaders and then follows the Munich conference.
We won't give it all away, but there's a crucial document that Hartman's very keen for Neville Chamberlain to see, which he thinks might change everything.
Yes, which is an actual document from the year before the Munich Agreement.
Hitler is lying when he claims to want peace. People will suffer. That document is the proof.
Wohin wollen Sie?
And they want to get this to Chamberlain before he signs the agreement. And their contacts in London make sure that Hugh Leggett travels with Chamberlain so the two men can meet and so they can hand over the document. And that's the sort of MacGuffin of the plot. But my real interest in many ways in the novel is in Neville Chamberlain, who seems to me a fascinating figure that I wanted to write about.
We can turn directly to Neville Chamberlain. He's got this terrible reputation. He's the appeaser. He's the opposite to Churchill. He's the guy who screwed it all up. But actually, the novel and the film paints a very, very different and more interesting picture.
I think so. And we could see how he put off war by a year to give us a chance to build our defences and whatever, and get the country ready for war.
You cannot play poker with a gangster without having some cards up one's sleeve.
Play him as a passionate and agonised man.
Yes, which I think he probably was. A man of great passion, a man whom the shadow of the First World War hung over. It's only 20 years ago. Well, 20 years ago, it fits, I don't know how it is for you, but for me, it feels like yesterday. So, of course, he didn't want to go to war. He wanted to try to put it off and possibly to avoid it. Nothing wrong with that, I think.
There are people who think that Britain survived the Second World War because Chamberlain put off the war for a year.
Yes, and I'd say I'm one of them. I think the final witness, really, for the fact that the Munich Agreement is not how most people think of it, but was actually a setback for Hitler, is Hitler himself, who hated the Munich Agreement, and even right at the end of his life in the bunker in 1945 was saying it was the greatest mistake and that if Germany had fought in 1938 they would have won.
And he might well have been right about that. This whole film, as it were, revolves around the pivot when finally Hitler and Chamberlain are eye to eye. I just wonder what research you've done, what you thought about what Chamberlain thought of Hitler when he met him.
Well, my research was basically Robert's book, which is extraordinary, and then also reading some of his speeches, watching him on screen, getting a feel for this man, and how he must have felt braving those 1,000 miles to Germany, insisting that Hitler come and meet him. I think he probably felt he can't trust this man, but let him at least get him in an arm lock. Yes, I wanted to have a private meeting with him, man to man, no officials. He invited me to his apartment.
What? No officials?
Not even you, Horace.
Oh, for God's sake, you can't go and see Hitler entirely on your own.
Can and will. Gentlemen, we must rise to the level of events.
Since we're talking about novels, you've got the Cicero novels coming out as a sort of single trilogy. Let me ask you about what you think, in terms of where we are in politics today, Cicero still has to teach.
I think that Cicero teaches us about the importance of trying to defend democratic institutions. I think that it's about the collapse of what seemed to be a pretty solid form of democracy under the pressures of populism, anti-elitism, and a division over what the nature of the democracy existed for. And Cicero fought to his dying breath to try and protect it. And I think that it has more relevance now, oddly enough.
I was going to say, the Prime Minister's a very big enthusiast for Cicero, so he's presumably learned from Cicero the importance of defending democracy.
Well, he's certainly learned the importance of being able to command an audience and tell jokes. And he was a great fan of the book, and he did go and see it when it was on stage. How much he's taken of Cicero's philosophy is another question.
I just wondered, looking at the last couple of years the Prime Minister has gone through with his illness and Brexit and the dramas in the courts and the dramas in the House of Commons, whether there's a novel there.
Yes, I'm sure there is. He's quite a difficult character to fictionalise, Johnson, because he is himself a kind of fictional Dickensian self-creation. So I'm not sure that one could possibly come up with anything from one's imagination that could outdo the real thing.
He's done too much of the work himself.
Yes, so I think that you could put Boris in a novel, but he wouldn't be believable. Really, novels rely upon a credible central figure. But I'm sure he will be done at some stage, and he'll probably do it himself, knowing him.
Yes. Jeremy Irons, Robert Harris, been fascinating talking to you both. Thank you so much for doing that. And Munich, The Edge of War, will open in selected cinemas from January the 7th and will be on Netflix from January the 21st. The Education Secretary for England, Nadim Zahawi, is with me. Welcome, Mr. Zahawi. Sir Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, has accused the Prime Minister of breaking the law in that video quiz that the Mirror got on its front page today. Do you think the police should investigate?
Well, I think Keir Starmer needs to make his mind up. One minute he says he doesn't want to play politics. The next minute he's, I think, being political and wrong on this. If you look at that picture that the Mirror has led with today, what do we see?
Which we can.
Put it up. What do we see? We see a Prime Minister in his office with two of his staff next to him. There's no drinks, taking 10 to 15 minutes, according to the Mirror, of his time to thank his team, by the way, who couldn't work from home. They had to be in 10 Downing Street because they're dealing with the national crisis of a pandemic. I think in many ways, the hype over the past 2 weeks around parties will quite rightly be investigated by the Cabinet Secretary.
You really think it's hype?
Well, my email box full of people thinking that these are sort of, parties with guests and, all sorts of things happening. Actually, they can now make their mind up when they see this picture of a Prime Minister on a virtual screen, on a Zoom call, thanking his team, who are in the building because they have to respond to a national emergency.
Okay.
Then they can make their mind up. And I think we're also, by the way, just to say on this, I'm not taking anything away from this. The Prime Minister has said that the Cabinet Secretary will investigate all events, alleged events, including in other departments, and will report back.
Right. Well, let's just stick with this event because London was in tier 2 at the time, and the law itself, which I've got here, says no person may participate in a gathering in a tier 2 area, number 10, which consists of 2 or more people and takes place indoors. Exception 4 is the gathering is reasonably necessary for work purposes. Now, clearly that wasn't. Party hats, Santa hats, tinsel, and that's 3 people in a room. We don't even know. We can't see the groups of 6 people on the other sides of the screens around Downing Street. How is the law not broken there?
Well, as I said, these are people who work together.
But you don't need a quiz for work.
Hold on a second. There's no drink here, right? I don't think there's a rule against, recognising Christmas with tinsel or a hat. 10 to 15 minutes to thank his team that are working all hours on a virtual screen in a pub quiz. I think people can make their own mind up on that. But listen, I want to obviously talk
remind
about
ourselves. I'm going to come to Omicron in a second. Let's remind ourselves of one person's verdict. I can understand how infuriating it must be to think that the people who have been setting the rules have not been following the rules, because I was also furious. Do you know who said that?
Yes, of course. And I know what you're going to say next on this, and I hope we do get to Omicron. We've only got a limited time together.
So that was the Prime Minister.
I hear you, which is why he's asked the Cabinet Secretary to investigate all allegations of any gatherings in number 10 Downing Street or in any other department. There was one in my department which we looked at, and the Perm Secretary apologised for. When I looked at the details, there were people, again, who had to work from the office.
Up and down the country, people had to work very hard, and they weren't allowed to have parties. Lots of people died, lots of people weren't allowed to see their loved ones at the time. That is why there is a problem. I ask you again about the party that started all of this, the party on December the 18th. Do you now accept, you've seen people laughing about it, do you now accept that there was a party?
Well, I think that's unfair, Andrew, because...
What, the question?
No, Allegra, who resigned over this, she resigned because she felt that the frivolity and the laughter, the Cabinet Secretary is looking at all allegations. I think it's only fair and right, because these are the values that we adhere to in this country, and I know that you hold high, that we should wait for that investigation, and then I'll happily be back on your programme and discuss it. Look, we've got...
I fear there won't be a programme to come back on, but nonetheless...
We've got limited time together, but I think there's an important issue around Omicron that I hope we can get to discuss, because this will be a national endeavour to try and make sure we bring the equilibrium back and control Omicron, which at the moment is proving challenging.
Let's just clear this up very, very quickly and simply then, because we are short of time. Was there a party?
Well, as I said, the Cabinet Secretary will investigate any allegations of gatherings or any other parties or anything else.
On Tuesday, the government said there wasn't a party. Now we can see everything slipping. People are beginning to accept that there was a party.
Well, as I said, look, the right thing to do is to allow the Cabinet Secretary to do this and do it swiftly and report back. That is the right thing to do. But from the Mirror has been doing the running on this. From this picture is a Prime Minister on a virtual screen, on a Zoom or Teams call, taking 10 to 15 minutes of his time out to thank his team who've been working all hours and can't work from home. They have to be in Number 10 working together.
If he misled the House of Commons in all of this, should he resign?
Well, I think the right thing to do, Andrew, is to wait for the Cabinet Secretary's investigation. This is all speculation now. I think we can keep going in this interview on this, or we can talk about something truly important to the nation, which is a variant that is, well, if you allow me just to finish this, a variant that is currently on an exponential growth curve. You will understand what exponential growth means. By the end of this month, we have 1 million infections. Within 3 days, it becomes 2 million. 3 days after that, it becomes 4 million. Now, even if it's half as severe as Delta, so 1% of people might be hospitalised for a period of time, and we are now seeing people in hospital with Omicron. That's first million is 10,000, right? 2 million is 20,000, and so on. Hence why we're taking these, I think, proportionate measures that will go before the House next week, and I hope will be voted on and cleared. And it's good to see that, at least on this issue, Keir Starmer doesn't want to play politics, and I hope he continues on that path and support the government, because the important thing is to boost the nation. This will be a national endeavour. I led the first booster campaign. We're going to do it again. The whole team is now primed and ready to go to make sure that we boost as many adults as we can, as fast as possible. It is a race against Omicron, Andrew.
One last question before we get on to Omicron, furthermore. Christopher Gate, the man charged with looking into the Downing Street refurbishment row, was not shown the crucial WhatsApp messages between the Prime Minister and a Conservative donor. Can you explain to people watching why not?
Well, I think I can say a couple of things on that. One, that Lord Geidt investigated and found that Prime Minister didn't breach any of the ministerial rules. Some people say but he should have declared it to Parliament. Actually, number 10 and the apartment in there is for the Prime Minister.
Another investigation.
No, just let me finish on this point. The Electoral Commission actually looked at all of this and actually didn't think there was anything wrong with the blind trust that was going to be set up that didn't get set up. The Prime Minister ultimately paid for this, unlike, and I hope you didn't ask here this, but £500,000 of refurbishment happened under Labour, which the taxpayer picked up. This was paid by the Prime Minister, not the taxpayer. So I think, again, it's important to get the facts out on this.
OK, well, let's turn. You were talking about COVID and Omicron. Let's turn to that. Now, you were talking about the vast rate of infections moving around the country at the moment. But so far, nobody has died from Omicron. Given that, are you really sure that these regulations you're putting before the House of Commons, and which so far 66 of your colleagues are going to vote against, are you really sure they're proportionate?
Yes, I am. And let me tell you why. 1/3 of infections now in London are Omicron. We know that Omicron is much more infectious than Delta. We've seen this movie before with Kent, and then Delta, and now with Omicron. So the doubling rate.
Sorry, we haven't seen this movie with a version that doesn't appear to kill people.
Let me just get there, right? And you just heard earlier from Susan Hopkins that actually there's a lag of 3 to 4 weeks before you see deaths coming through. We're beginning to see people in hospital with it here in the UK. And, of course, in South Africa. Now, let's just do a mathematical exercise. If we get to 1 million infections by the end of December, 3 days later, that's 2 million. If 1%, if it is half as severe as Delta, and 1% have severe infection, need hospitalisation, that's 10,000 people with the first million, and it keeps going that way.
Okay.
We have 100,000
with that a bit.
Well, we have 100,000 beds in the NHS, right? We need to make sure that we control this virus through the booster campaign. We know another thing about it, that actually 2 doses are not enough. You need that boost. So we are going to have a national endeavour to boost as many people as rapidly as possible, because we are in a race against Omicron. Why? I still think, as Patrick Vallon said, we are transitioning this virus from pandemic to endemic, but this is a big bump on the road, and we've got to deal with it.
Do you think
this is proportionate?
Do you think this is a milder version?
So even if it is a milder version, which looks likely from South Africa...
But do you think it is or not?
Well, the data from South Africa looks like it's less severe, and that actually T cells and antibodies seem to be holding it from severe infection. But small percentage of a very large population will put many people in hospital. So we're acting proportionately, we're acting early. We'll review it on the 5th of January. These are temporary measures that we're introducing. They have a sunset clause on them. People talk about vaccine passports. This is not a vaccine passport. These are high-risk events where we're asking people either take a free lateral flow test or to be vaccinated to attend. So we need to get this in perspective. It's slightly run away with us the last few days around vaccine passports, and I think that's wrong. And I'm sure...
we can maybe agree it's a limited form of vaccine passport, but nonetheless, mask wearing, an instruction to work at home if you can, vaccine passport, this kind of vaccine passport. These are all measures that are going to the House of Commons this week. They are measures that have been used in Scotland all the way through, and they have completely failed to even halt Omicron in Scotland. It's rising just as fast. So why do you think it's going to work in England?
Well, a couple of things. One, the most important thing is the booster campaign. So we are going to be turbocharging the booster campaign. The team is back in. Emily Lawson is back heading it. We're all, I have volunteered to make sure that I do everything in my power to explain it to the nation why it's so important to get your booster when you're eligible. Now on Monday, we'll open it to the 30s-year-olds. 2, the work from home, the scientists tell us, is the most effective way to keep people apart.
Right.
The third thing, it's only high-risk events where we're asking either a lateral flow test or a vaccine certificate. That is, I think, proportionate as we see where we hopefully arrive at with the booster, because the boosters will protect the most vulnerable. That's what you want to do. You've got to protect the most vulnerable quickly to keep them obviously safe and out of hospital.
Let's talk specifically about the booster rollout so far, because only 18% of 40 to 50-year-olds have had a third jab so far. So, you're moving it down to the 30s, but actually that crucial group, you're way, way behind. You're doing on average, I think, 396,000 boosters a day. The target is 500,000, 500,000. But you need to double that, don't you, to hit the target, to get ahead of Omicron. So you need a massive, massive ramp up of the booster programme, don't you?
Yeah, we do. Absolutely right. And we are focused on that. We've been working literally all of last week, whilst there's been this sort of hype around gatherings. The Prime Minister has been working on the plan of how we're going to mobilise again, bring everybody back together. Of course, the NHS in the lead, primary care network, GPs, community pharmacies, our brilliant military volunteers. We're asking people to come forward and volunteer through the National Volunteering Service. We've seen some amazing things.
Are you worried that not enough people are coming forward? It's not just producing them, but you're not getting enough people coming forward to take them.
So a couple of things. One, lots of people are coming forward. You saw some queues yesterday at walk-in centres, and I have to say people on the whole have been behaving well. We've had a couple of incidents that worry me in the East Midlands. One incident specifically where someone was very aggressive, and that should not happen to anybody who's administering a life-saving vaccine. But we've seen some amazing examples. A school in East London vaccinating students and teachers and parents who've never had a vaccine. The Home Park in Plymouth staying till 2 a.m. vaccinating. We have got more to do in London, Birmingham, Manchester, and the cities to get people out.
You're getting enthusiastic, naturally, about your old job. Let me ask you about your current job. How many schools are closing or partially closed because of COVID at the moment?
So 99% of schools are open. They're being supported. We stood up the fund to support schools if they need teachers, additional workforce if their teachers are off with COVID. So again, I want to thank teachers, head teachers and support staff in schools to keep schools open and make sure that things like nativities happen so that children get that vital support and education that they need.
Can you guarantee that schools will not close as part of any measures facing this new wave going forward?
We will do everything in our power to protect education as we deal with Omicron. Everything. All the data suggests that the best place for the Children's Commissioner's 500,000 interviews with students demonstrate that the mental anguish, the health aspects of this.
So can I just ask you one thing, because we are running out of time, because some of your colleagues suggest that you could change the law to ensure that schools are seen as part of the vital infrastructure of this country and therefore cannot be closed.
Well, I will do everything in my power to make sure schools. Well, at the moment, I think the right thing to do is to boost the most vulnerable, the people who will be most impacted by Omicron, but the protection of schools is a priority for this government.
One last very quick question. Can you guarantee that in January schools will be open everywhere?
We are absolutely working to make sure that all schools are open, they're protected.
Not quite a guarantee.
Well, I will do everything in my power. We are still learning about this variant. We know that a booster works. Get boosted, protect yourself, protect your community, and let's get through this and transition this from pandemic to endemic as quickly as we can.
Nadim Zahawi, thanks very much for coming in and talking to us. Thanks to all of you for watching. Until next Sunday, one more Sunday, goodbye.